It is March 13, 2018, and we have a twofer for today. We just got done interviewing Dr. Tara Westover about her amazing book, Educated. Phenomenal interview. A reminder that we'll be having Tara Westover in Salt Lake City, March 29th, for a book signing and a Q&A. We're really excited about that book. It's a very powerful book. Go buy it, go read it, Educated. It's taking the nation and the world by storm. And we loved interviewing her. We are doing a twofer, though. We're interviewing someone else as well today. This is my friend, Bert Fuller. It turns out I went to BYU as a freshman with Bert's...
I think it's my dad's cousin.
Bert's dad's cousin, Ron Fuller. Ron was raised in a home where he wasn't raised as an active devout Mormon, by sort of post-Mormon or ex-Mormon parents. And Ron was one of the first people to ever introduce me to doubts and questions about the church. I remember him theorizing that the church may have given blacks the priesthood out of pressure or threats to lose their tax-exempt status. That was Ron. And
it was actually from Ron that I heard about you. Yeah.
Yeah. So Ron definitely challenged my testimony as a freshman. I ended up overcoming those challenges, serving a mission. Ron also served a mission. Now it's sort of crisscrossed. Ron has become very Orthodox or devout as I conceive of him. He called me just the other day, in fact. And, well, you know what happened to me. So anyway, Bert is from the Fuller family. This is Bert Fuller. And I just want to tell everyone at the outset, every once in a while I meet someone who is incredibly both insightful and intelligent and prescient about everything that's going on. And I'm going to say that Bert's going to come across as one of the most credible, thoughtful people I interview on Mormon Stories. That's my bias. That's my opinion. So please know that ahead of time. He has appeared on Mormon Stories at least once before, right?
With Dan and Lloyd.
With Lloyd Erickson and Dan Witherspoon, where we talked about Neo-Apologetics a little bit. But this is sort of, let's just say, a bit of a conclusion to my series on Neo-Apologetics. The reason why we're interviewing Bert is because Bert, for 2.5 years, worked for the Maxwell Institute of what? Religious Studies?
Scholarship, I think it's the full title. Mm-hmm.
So he worked with... was Daniel Petersen there at the time, or
no? I was hired right after all of that had taken place.
So Bradford was still there. Jerry
Bradford was the director the entire time I was there.
Morgan was there.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Was Blair there yet?
Blair was hired right after me.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And then would you have been there when Spencer Fluman started, or?
I wasn't. I had started my PhD in Toronto by that time, but I met him just after his appointment because I was at BYU for a summer seminar, and he was one of our lunch guests that spoke about it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I actually met Spencer Fluman first when I was invited to attend one of those luncheons at summer seminar back when Bushman was involved.
Oh, okay.
Way back in the day. That was my introduction. Anyway, we've been talking about Neo-Apologetics for many, many episodes. We interviewed Tom Christofferson, who I think in some ways fits in that camp. We've talked to Dan and Lloyd about this. We've interviewed people like John Ogden, and we've tried to sort of discuss and review the church's new approach to apologetics, and now it's time to do a critique of it. And since Bert worked at the Maxwell Institute for 2.5 years, he now has a lot of very strong feelings feelings or opinions.
I have a lot of strong feelings about a lot of things. Yeah,
he has opinions about. Specifically about Neo-Apologetics. He has critiques of Neo-Apologetics, and he has experience from within Mormon apologetics and the Maxwell Institute. So that's why we're interviewing Bert. And we're also going to hear his story and his insight, because it's definitely worth exploring. So I'm really excited about that. I want to welcome everyone who's joining us live on Facebook Live. We are going to have plenty of time for questions and comments. Please like this episode. Please share it on your wall. If there's anyone you think has experience with Spencer Fluman, with the Maxwell Institute, with Daniel Petersen or Lewis Midgley or apologetics, we want to get any of those insights here. So please message or Facebook that this episode's happening, and invite anyone to join us to make comments, to share impressions, to share experiences, because we just think it's so much more fun and interesting when these interviews are interactive. Just to take care of a tiny bit of business before we begin, these podcasts are made possible by people who donate to the Open Stories Foundation and Mormon Stories podcast. If you appreciate this programming, if you're not a donor, if you are a donor, thank you. If you're not a donor, please consider subscribing. We can't do this for free. We have an entire staff now with Amy Grubbs and Cody Layton and Sharon Price and myself who are trying to keep the nonprofit alive and sustainable and to plan for its future. So just know that your donations are tax deductible. We are transparent in our finances. We'll be releasing our end of year report very, very soon. And most importantly, we spend all that money, literally all of it, in support of our mission as a foundation, which is to inform people about Mormonism, to help people make informed decisions about their lives, and to provide people who are transitioning away from Mormon orthodoxy, either towards progressive or liberal Mormonism or outside of Mormonism, to provide them with support and community, workshops, retreats, content that will be meaningful. So please support us. We do have several events coming up in the future. Again, we have Tara Westover coming March 29th here to Salt Lake City. She will be doing a book signing and a live Q&A with our audience. So please come to that. It's at First Unitarian Church in downtown Salt Lake City. We also have workshops and retreats coming up. In June 8th through 10th, we're going to have one of those amazing Mormon Stories retreats in Salt Lake City that really does transform lives, save marriages, help people raising their kids, finding community, helping them communicate with believing family members. They're phenomenal events, rated 4.8 or 4.9 out of 5 every time. And people say it really transforms their lives. So we've got Salt Lake City, June 8th through 10th. We've got Houston, July 13th through 15th. We've got Idaho Falls, August 10th through 11th. And then we've got the cruise, October 24th through 28th, which is going to be more fun, just requested by our listeners, a lot less clinical or pastoral. And then finally, if you want us to bring a workshop or a retreat to your area, you just have to reach out, mormonstories@gmail.com. We've heard a lot about Denver and Colorado Springs, Fort Collins area wanting another event. We just did Phoenix and Las Vegas. Those were phenomenal. Actually, we did Phoenix, but we think we could probably do Las Vegas again. St. George was great. We also want to do Boise. But if you want to bring a workshop or retreat, we just need your help organizing it. So please consider that. All right. So without any further ado, again, we want to welcome everyone. And Bert Fuller, we want to welcome you back to Mormon Stories Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So let's begin by talking a little bit about your Mormon upbringing and the extent to which the church played a role in your formative years.
Sure. My father's of pioneer stock, and as I always understood it growing up, his grandmother, who was born in the year 1900 around Colonia Juarez, I assume into some kind of polygamous family. I was born in 1988, and when I was very little in San Dimas, California, we lived right next door to my dad's parents, and my great-grandma was getting pretty old, so she was there as well. So I kind of feel like, that pioneer past was very present for me. My mom was born and raised in Oklahoma as a Presbyterian, and then she joined the LDS Church as, I think she might have been 25, 26, somewhere around there. Served a mission, met my dad at OU. They got married, and I've got 2 older sisters, 1 younger sister, and we grew up for the first part of my life in San Dimas, California. Then we moved for 4 years or so, lived in Oklahoma, moved there around the same time as the Oklahoma City bombing. And then when we moved back to California, it was to the high desert in San Bernardino County. So I was 11 and grew up in Apple Valley, California, and attended middle school and high school there. And I felt like in terms of my conscious awareness of the church, that didn't start until I was in Apple Valley as a high school student, particularly.
Okay, so the religious dynamics, anything you're able to say about the religious dynamics with your parents early in those years? Were your parents Orthodox? Were they mixed?
Well, here's one story. I remember, I said it was high school when I started becoming consciously aware of things. And in a Sunday school class, somebody said that you're not supposed to eat out on Sunday. And I didn't know that was a rule. And I, the way my mom tells it, I don't remember this. Apparently, I, came out of the class, church was over. I see her in the hallway. She's just getting out of Relief Society. And I say, just in front of everybody, Mom, did you know we're not supposed to eat out on Sundays? Because I didn't think anything of it. I thought, oh, well, if I didn't know, then maybe they don't know. And so I didn't feel like we were particularly Orthodox, but the thing that was most Orthodox is that we did attend every week. I don't remember a single, I don't remember ever missing church 2 Sundays in a row. Like I might have missed it once because I was sick or we were traveling or something like that, but I never remembered missing twice. I mean, it's just something you did every Sunday. So.
Okay. And so religion was pretty important in your family growing up.
Yeah, I'd say so, on both sides, right? And so my Presbyterian side, because, spoiler alert, I don't attend the LDS church anymore. But so they were understanding of that, but they were very concerned that I still believed in God, or that I didn't kind of give up faith altogether. And so, yeah, I'd say that religion was just an important part of my extended family fabric. Yeah, I think that's fair.
Okay. So you it seems like you kind of had a Mormon intellectual and maybe even spiritual awakening kind of in high school.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
Well, first thing is I go to early morning seminary first day, and they say, you got to read your scriptures every day. And I didn't know that people read the scriptures. I just thought they were around long enough, sort of like, Bill Murray on Groundhog Day. He's like, I am a God, he's just around long enough. It sort of seeps in by osmosis. And I'd always been a good student. So I was like, okay, I'll read the scriptures. But I did read the scriptures, the Book of Mormon primarily, on and off as a freshman. But it wasn't until the fall of my sophomore year where I felt really kind of depressed and unhappy with where I was spiritually. And I wanted to figure that out. And when I spoke with my bishop, he gave me the advice that, and he was a convert as well, just reading the scriptures daily and saying your prayers daily. He's like, yeah, you'll still have 2 bad hair days a month, but that can really make a difference. And I took that seriously. And so from the time I was 15 till just the last few months, I read my scriptures and prayed every single day. I mean, you miss some days, obviously, but probably on an average between 30 and 60 minutes every day for 13 years. And when I started, I became aware very quickly that I did not know anything about what the scriptures actually said. Because my first time through the Book of Mormon, the thing that hit me the strongest was when King Benjamin said, if you see a homeless person or a beggar, it's not your place to judge how they got there. It's your place to help them. And that was the opposite of what I had been taught by the church, by my family, by school, by TV, by just friends. In my experience, I'm not speaking for everybody's. That I was 14 at the time. My experience was limited, obviously. And so when I realized that my understanding of the world could be turned completely upside down, I stopped assuming that I didn't have assumptions or pretensions that I understood, like who Jesus was or what the doctrine was or Joseph Smith or church organizations. So yeah, I just devoured this stuff because I really wanted to understand it. Yeah.
So what how did you form, and kind of what did you build during that intellectual and spiritual awakening? What type of gospel worldview did you put together?
That's a good question. For me, always the basis was scripture and personal revelation. And so I read that always, but by the time I had graduated high school, I'd read the New Testament, the Book of Mormon several times. I'd read the Doctrine and Covenants, read the Old Testament. So I'd read the entire standard works by the time I had graduated high school, and I continued to do so. But I also listened to those Truman Madsen lectures on Joseph Smith. My brother-in-law gave them to me once he got home from his mission. And I read Rough Stone Rolling as a freshman at BYU. It had just come out a few months before. But I also read a lot of Bruce McConkie, Joseph Fielding Smith, James Talmage, John Woodsoe, Hugh Nibley. I just read a lot. To me, it felt like a lot because growing up, I'd never really read much at all. I'd rather play video games or something like that. And so the takeaway that I got was a strange mixture because I was really piecing it together myself. I didn't feel like I belonged to some camp. Like somebody might be more of a McConkie Mormon, whereas somebody might be more of like a Sterling McMurrin Mormon or something like that. But I never felt like that. I was just, my approach was always, like take what is good, leave what is bad, which is kind of the missionary mentality that George Albert Smith said to new converts, and which I appreciate because my mom received a lot of good from her Presbyterian upbringing, and it seemed very reasonable to me. And so if I ever read something I didn't like it because Hugh Nibley said it, and I didn't dislike it because Bruce McConkie said it or whatever. I just cared about what it was and then test it that way. And so I felt like my worldview was very hodgepodge, but it was very individualistic. I valued personal revelation and personal searching, but it wasn't anti-community. It was very pro-community, right? Like we need each other because salvation is individual and exaltation is communal. We need each other, but we don't need each other to all be the same. We need each other to be ourselves and then working in concert. Like I felt like that's the picture that I developed. Yeah. And
so in what ways would your beliefs and behaviors have been sort of normal Orthodox versus sort of unorthodox?
Let's
say up before your mission.
Before my mission. Maybe this is weird to say, but I think even just reading the scriptures every day was pretty heterodox. I feel like most people don't do that. And so there's kind of like an orthodox level where it's like, oh, this is what we should be doing. But then there's an orthoprax level of this is what we're actually doing. So maybe it was heteropraxis or something like that for me to be studying as much as I was, because I found that that's kind of unusual. But I remember taking very seriously anything that general authority said. I didn't just assume it was right, but I felt like it was, I did assume that it was worth taking seriously. And then I would test ideas out with friends or family members or whatever. What do you think about this? Or what do you think about that? And it became apparent to me very quickly that, that people would agree or disagree with something for reasons I didn't find compelling. Like I read The Miracle of Forgiveness, right? And in it, Spencer Kimball says women shouldn't wear, I think he says they shouldn't wear pants. Or maybe he says shorts, I don't remember, just in public or something like that. And so I asked my bishop at BYU and his wife. It actually turned out being Truman Madsen's son, which I thought was like providential because Truman Madsen was so influential on me as a teenager. I asked them, what do they think about that? And they're like, oh, well, that was just his culture at the time, you know? And that's pretty unsatisfying for me as an explanation. And so, but it would happen all over the place. Like I'd listen to a Bruce McConkie talk where he'd say, you're not supposed to have a personal relationship with Jesus. And at the time I felt like I understood where he was coming from. And then if I talked to people like, what do you think about that? And they would just feel like deeply offended by it. And I wondered why, because my high school, there was a lot of evangelicals and they were all about like having a personal relationship with Jesus. And I was taught we were the one true church. Like I believed that very deeply. And how could we be the one true church if all you need is a personal relationship with Jesus and you need to, accept him in your heart or whatever? And so I thought that this doctrine or this idea was very flimsy and it didn't So I mean, now I'm to a point where I just like don't particularly care what LDS general authorities say, but at the time I very much did. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So in terms of like anthropomorphic God, would you have believed that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, why not?
And literal reresurrection.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, sure.
Atonement. And how would you view Joseph Smith? Did you have a nuanced view of Joseph Smith at the time?
So I really had two sources of learning about Joseph Smith because I didn't assume that anybody around me was right in what they said about Joseph Smith because they were wrong about the King Benjamin thing. And so I didn't assume that, like, whatever people told me, I'd be like, okay, I'll look into that. And that's been always been my attitude. And so I had two sources. Number one was those Truman Madsen lectures. I think he gave a series of 8, and then they were so successful, he gave an additional series of 8. And, you know, that's very much sort of the heroic, boyish, innocent type Joseph Smith. And then as a freshman at BYU, I read Rough Stone Rolling, like I said. And I remember feeling a little let down by it, not because Joseph Smith is, how do we want to phrase it, a morally complex figure in some respects. It wasn't that. I just cared, like, I just wanted to know, like, who he was, and I wasn't in a mood for judging him, like saying don't do this or don't do that or whatever. I just wanted to know what he did, and so yeah, I learned a bunch of stuff like that he had wine or that he was polygamous or this or that, but I didn't really feel affected by it. I don't know. I think that reflects poorly on me, but that's just how it was. That's just the truth.
So you were pretty, I mean, this sounds a little bit precocious.
Yeah, I'm extremely precocious and pretentious. I've been called both of those things many times, yes. And I think it's accurate. I don't think people are wrong when they describe me in these ways. Yeah.
So for a high school kid to be listening to the Truman Madsen tapes or learning about Joseph Smith and wine or... Yeah, that's, and reading like you said, taking the scripture seriously. That's, right. Yeah, that's abnormal. Right.
Right. And I remember I quite enjoyed seminary actually, and I had wonderful seminary teachers all 4 years. And it got to the point where my senior year, that was Old Testament, and I was reading it at the time. My teacher is just the sweetest. I love her. If I can I say her name? Yeah. Lori Failer. She's just so wonderful, you know? And she would prepare a lesson, like it would be on the book of Daniel or something. And she'd be teaching the lesson out of the manual, and I'd ask a question, and she never, ever shut me down. Never shut me down. But she just said, I knew as I was preparing this lesson, you would ask about, you know, like the guy with the writing on the wall of the temple, and she's just like, and I wish that I could help you understand it more. I just don't. And she was always very like upfront about that. And she was really complimentary of, she's like, how do you remember this and that and whatever? And to me, it just, I've only ever lived my own life, so it didn't seem abnormal. Yeah.
Okay. So you it sounds like this studying as a high school kid didn't lead to a faith crisis for you.
No, of course not. Yeah. Because for me, my faith was not handed to me. For me, I began with the premise like, okay, I am going to study this out in my mind, pray about it, taste the fruit, all of that, you know, jazz. And I'm going to keep the good and let go of the bad. And so, no, I didn't have a faith crisis because I mean, in a way you could say that I was a little like a nihilist as a kid or something. Like I didn't have faith in anything, you know, I started developing faith, but it was always on my own terms. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, was there a moment where you like did the Moroni 10:4 thing and prayed to know if the church was true? Like wanted to really know?
I mean, I did it because they told me to, but I never had special experiences with that I could talk about. No, it was much more like spiritual illumination that I experienced. Sometimes it was the flash in the pan, but most of the time it was just like the rising of the sun, you know, very subtle, but the difference between day and night is obviously clear when you consider them both. It was more like that.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And some of the intellectual concerns that maybe you would have stumbled onto later, like historicity of the Book of Mormon, Book of Abraham, polyandry, you know, racism, sexism, homophobia, would any of that have occurred to you? And how did you avoid reading the Book of Mormon closely and not starting to have those thoughts?
Yeah. As far as historicity went, I was always of the opinion that the Book of Mormon mattered more as a source of spiritual guidance and enlightenment. And I assumed the historicity because that seemed valid given what I was taught growing up. But I never investigated it because I was never preoccupied with it. I just didn't care.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't care.
And the Book of Mormon didn't trip up the archaeological or historical stuff, didn't pop out to you when you were reading it at the time?
No, I don't think so. One, because I was just like profoundly ignorant, right? Like I never read books or had any sense of what is taken, largely for granted, so.
You just
yeah.
believed it.
Yeah. And because there was a quote that I heard by Joseph Smith, and I think I heard it first through Hugh Nibley, but he said that a man would never be damned for believing too much, right? He'd be damned for not believing enough, not having faith.
Right.
And so I really liked that because what, for me, it meant in practical terms was I'm not going to assume the worst about a thing. I will take it on its own terms. And this is actually a type of... do you know what I mean when I say like hermeneutic? Like a,
Sure.
kind of like an approach to interpretation that a Mormon guy named Wayne Booth, who's actually, let's see, it would be my wife's grandfather's cousin.
He passed away in the past
Yeah.
few years.
Right. Yeah. And he was born in American Fork, but became like a major literary critic. And that's my field, literary criticism. He became a major literary critic with the University of Chicago. And he had kind of a little saying. He said, we have to first seek to understand before we overstand. Right. And that was always my approach. And then I forget who it was. It's a non-Mormon guy. I'd have to look it up. Richard Bushman is fond of quoting this, but he talks about a Mormon hermeneutic of generosity. Right, which is in counterweight to what was known as the hermeneutic of suspicion, which was dominates literary theory and criticism for many, many decades. And so that was an attitude or approach I always appreciated. So when it comes to these issues that you're talking about, I always felt like I'm not going to have a hard opinion about something unless I look into it. But once I look into it, and I'm still open to people correcting my opinions, but if the people trying to correct my opinions clearly have not looked into it as deeply as me, then as far as I'm concerned, they do not carry the same weight and authority that they think they might. So that's very important to me. I'm open to it. I'm open to being corrected, but make sure you're in a position to correct. I'm sensitive about that. Yeah.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
So you served a mission.
I did, to Poland. Yeah.
Anything you want to share about that?
I loved it. I mean, it was tough. I think anybody that has a mission knows that it's tough.
That was post Lech Walesa. How do you pronounce that?
Lech?
The guy who sort of liberated Poland, or is known. Am I getting the wrong country?
You're not getting the wrong country.
Oh, okay.
But at the time, up until about 3 or 4 years ago, I was always very apolitical. It was just not something I knew anything about. Okay. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
For those of us Cold War people that saw Eastern Europe fall, that was a name that popped out of my mind. Anyway,
yeah, so I served, I entered the MTC, I think it was June 10th or 12th of 2007. And then, I got home July 1st of 2009.
Okay.
So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you enjoyed it. Anything worth mentioning about your mission that would play into your story? Experiences or doubts or questions or, anti-Mormons you ran into, anything like that?
Well, I mean, it's anti-Mormon discourse in Poland is pretty pathetic, as you might imagine.
Sure.
So I think folks that serve English-speaking missions run into that a lot more. But for me, here was something that was very important to me. When I was at BYU, that first year, academic year of 06 to 07, my first semester, I signed up for a couple religion classes because I liked it so much, and one of them was world religions. Roger, I forget his last name. Keller, that's the guy.
I took him too.
Oh, did you really? Yeah, he might be retired now, but he did it for many years.
He wrote the manual.
Yeah, he was
great,
one of the co-authors.
I thought it was a great class.
Yeah, I thought so too. He was a convert to Mormonism, and that class taught me this sort of openness towards other religions. which I wasn't necessarily opposed to, but I really got to appreciate like the beauty and the interest of studying comparative religion and all that kind of thing. And so when I got to Poland, and Poland's I think polled at the most religious country in Europe. I know there were a lot of missionaries who like just hated the Catholic Church for this or that other reason. And for me, I was like, I don't have a problem with the Catholic Church until I learn there's a problem. Like, I'm not going to assume that, you know, all these things you're saying are so bad. And so I remember being a trainee, and, you know, shout out to my trainer, because he was very patient, I think, as most missionary trainers need to be. But he was very good and very wonderful and patient with me, and I was not an easy companion to have. But I remember we were just walking, and, you know, he was kind of dissatisfied with the overwhelming presence of Catholicism, and I liked the architecture and the things like that. And he pointed out that gargoyles on churches, like, why would you have monsters there? And to me, this like didn't bug me, you know, but it seemed to bug a lot of other people.
The gargoyles didn't bug you?
No, I thought it was cool, man.
Isn't it just Baroque architecture?
Yeah, like I just thought it, like I kind of have an appetite for like all sorts of strange things or differences or something that doesn't quite fit. It's like, that's a good question. Why are there monsters on churches, you know? But for me, it's not
condemning.
It doesn't feel at first blush like offensive. It feels at first blush like kind of weird and interesting. Like, let's look into this.
And we should say you're getting your PhD in what?
Medieval studies. So that's, yeah. And that was kind of an accident, actually. It just happened that way. Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So, so anything else about your mission that's worth mentioning?
I mean, you know, I kept a journal every day, and there was a custom bookbinder who turned my journal into this beautiful book. And I didn't miss a day, I don't think, you know? And so my journal is like 700 plus pages. I could talk about my mission for, ever, but I don't feel like there's anything key.
As it relates to your faith transition and apologetics?
Well, I mean, I'll tell this because I just thought of this story recently. My mission president, he was from Denmark. Again, he was a convert to the church as well. And I think it was near my exit interview, I had a doctrinal question for him. And I just said, you know, President, can I ask you a question? And his response was like my seminary teacher. It was, he said, well, you can ask it, but I'm not going to like presume that I know the answer. And it was a question about like blood, kind of the doctrine of blood. How is it that Jesus's garments are made white in blood? Like, this doesn't make any sense to me. And, you know, he offered his opinion, and but nothing authoritative, you know? And so this is how I thought. I always had good priesthood leaders. I always had good teachers. I always had people who I felt like encouraged my curiosity and admitted their own ignorance if they couldn't answer a question. So my experiences were always very positive.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you get home from your mission, and maybe take us to the point where you started getting interested in the Maxwell Institute.
Okay, sure. Yeah. I was like broker than broke, as a lot of returned missionaries are. And they just happened to be opening up an In-N-Out burger in Orem that same fall that I got home. Well, I worked at In-N-Out as a high school student in California. And so my old boss, he had moved up here to be a manager, and he got me an interview, and I got the job. And it was so nice because then I could actually, you know, like eat food and pay my rent and whatever. And at the same time, my wife and I met. So we met October of 2009, and then we got married in June 2010.
This wasn't that long ago, man.
No, well, what is it? 2018 now? Yeah, I've been married like
9 years ago.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
You're at BYU working for In-N-Out.
Yeah. It's true, and lots changed, but it's really true. And so I always worked at In-N-Out to pay the bills, but I always wanted other jobs, things that could help me leverage a career. And my wife and I, we really had to have that deep talk of, am I going to go the law school route or am I going to go the scholar route? And she boiled it down to, there's a million reasons why the law school route is better, but I know that you going the scholar route is what you need to do. Mm-hmm. And she was very supportive, and she still is. And so that's the route that I took. And I think my first semester back from my mission, because I was an English major, I signed up for Petersen's class, and that's Hugh Nibley's youngest daughter. She's a medievalist. and I loved it. She's zany and fun and wonderful, and then that next semester I took her Chaucer class. And so I kind of feel like my interest in Mormon stuff just kind of accidentally led me into a career path for medieval studies. And it so happens that the other medievalist I worked really closely with in that department, Miranda Wilcox, also publishes on Mormon topics. So both her and Zina do. Miranda was one of the editors of, I think the book was called Standing Apart, and it's sort of revisiting the apostasy narrative. Right? And that's something that a medievalist would be very interested in, of course, because you actually read these texts and you realize like, oh, the medieval Catholic Church, I mean, sure, it has problems, but it's not like this evil empire or something like that. And so just revisiting a lot of that. And I'm working at In&Out. All told, including my high school years and BYU years, I ended up working for In&Out for a total of 4 years. And through most of that time at BYU, I was trying to find other work, something that could help me leverage more into a career direction. It never happened that way, so I took a leap of faith and I just, submitted my 2 weeks at In&Out. I'm going to guess this was the spring of 2012. I'd have to double check the dates, but that sounds right to me. And I was just going to decide, okay, well, once a day, I'm just going to try to apply or find one job, and I'll just keep doing that until I get one. And I get it at my first day. I get to work with one of my high school buddies at the service station at BYU, which was fine. I took a pay cut, but it was a change of pace, and I liked it. And I could do homework. I could study Greek while I was there, which was awesome. And so to me, it was a better move because at In&Out, you're busy 100% of the time. At this job, I was busy like 10% of the time, and I could use 90% of that time to study Greek or whatever. That would help me leverage my career as a scholar. And after I'd been there 5 months, my cousin, my very close cousin, said, "Bert, these things that you're always talking about, you got to meet my neighbor. You got to meet my neighbor." And so he introduced me to his neighbor, who was Christian Heel, and Christian. I did bring a resume because Spencer asked me to, but I didn't know there was like a job. I just sat down to meet with Christian, and Christian was like, "All right, well, when can you start?" And he's at the Maxwell Institute, and so he hires me.
What does he do at the Maxwell Institute?
So at the time, this might not make a lot of sense, or maybe a lot of people don't know this, but the Maxwell Institute is an umbrella institution. And within that umbrella, it has a lot of autonomous or kind of discrete research initiatives. Now, the exact makeup of it today has shifted somewhat, and I'm not as familiar with it. But at the time, you had something like the Laura F. Willis Center for Book of Mormon Studies. You had CPART, which was the Center for the Preservation of Ancient Religious Texts, which is what Christian, he was the director of, and that's who I worked with.
Is that where Morgan works?
No, Morgan works with MEDI, which is the I think it's the Middle Eastern Text Initiative, which is what Dan Petersen, I think, founded. And then it's a publishing house as well. So you have the production team. You also have the endowed chair, which is John Gee. I think it's the Robert Gay chair, endowed chair. And I don't know if it's specifically for Egyptology, but that would make sense given John Gee's expertise.
Kind of just a chair to protect the Book of Abraham. I mean, is that fair to say?
I don't think...
Is that reductionistic?
It's mildly reductionistic because I don't know how many people really use John Gee as a go-to for defending their own faith nowadays. I think back in the heyday of farms, it was more like that.
Spencer Fluman mentioned it in the recent...
What did he say?
When he was doing I had just recently the Miller couple,
which I didn't get a chance to listen to, which I'm sad about.
They shared with us their experience speaking with Spencer Fluman, who heads the Maxwell Institute now.
Right. Yeah.
And in that interview, Spencer he says we've got a PhD down the hall who went to Yale, and he's super familiar with the Book of Abraham, and he could go into depth with you.
He said this?
Absolutely.
That's a little surprising to me.
Why are you laughing?
Well, because...
you don't take Gee seriously as a scholar who can really defend the Book of Abraham.
Well, I don't have a particular opinion as far as that question goes. But look, this is public knowledge that before I was hired, there was a fallout between Dan Petersen and the Maxwell Institute leadership at the time. And I don't know what I can and can't say, but my understanding was it had something to do with you and your podcast. And without getting into all of that, people were really glad that the dust settled. Because look, the people at the Maxwell Institute, genuinely, most of them, like almost all of them, don't want to do apologetics. They just want to do scholarship. Like that was absolutely my experience when I was there. That's what they want to do. And so they felt like, focusing on kind of attacking people who are detracting from the church or whatever was number one, unbecoming of a university research institute, but number two, kind of a waste of time. Like
how about counterproductive?
Yeah, I mean, very counterproductive as well. And so
and you're saying people in the Maxwell Institute that you've spoken with didn't like that was going on.
Yeah, that seems very clear. And you can read this you can read this on I don't need secret knowledge to be able to, come to that opinion.
And I'll just break in. I think this history is kind of important, and it does relate to me. But, we've talked about this in prior episodes, but for those who don't know, the Maxwell Institute was Farms before it was the Maxwell Institute.
Kind of, yeah.
Kind of, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it was Hugh Nibley who kind of set that precedent with Von Brody of attacking
That's right.
anyone who's
That's
a critic.
Fair to say.
And so then Daniel Petersen comes on, Lou Midgley comes on, people like Greg Smith came on. And while Petersen was heading the Institute, he was commissioning things like the 100 or 200 page hit pieces that were done against me. They would make personal critiques of Brett Metcalf, insults of other scholars, the attacks on, Simon Southerton when he did his DNA work. And it was just this long, multiple decades long history of maligning anyone who happens to ask a question that they deem inappropriate. And yes, so when I caught wind from a source within the Maxwell Institute that Daniel Petersen and Greg Prince and Midgley were
not Greg Prince, right? Greg Smith.
Yeah. Were working on this piece about me. Mm-hmm. I let Marlon Jensen and Elder Holland know.
I'm glad you did, by the way.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people at the Maxwell Institute were really glad that you did because they just want to do their scholarship. They're kind of fed up with all these shenanigans, right?
Yeah. And my argument was, first of all, I'm helping you guys, Greg, we pulled together that survey that the church used to justify, Marlon Jensen used to help justify the essays that later come out. We're the ones who surveyed the 3,000, non-believing disaffected Mormons. We put that research together, and Marlon Jensen literally asked us to sit on those results so that he could use that research to convince the brethren to do the essays. So after having helped the church so much, I'm like, you're really going to attack me? Like you're going to use tithing dollars at BYU, my alma mater, to try and attack me personally.
And I would add one little important shift is, okay, clearly we don't know where the money comes from to fund certain things, but my understanding is all Maxwell Institute initiatives are donor funded. But that doesn't make it better. In my mind, it makes it worse because people were basically receiving money to attack specific individuals that sometimes donors said, I want you to attack this specific individual. And I think that was the case in your case. But this is hearsay.
Donors gave money to the Maxwell Institute to go after me.
That's my understanding.
Yeah, I've heard that. In fact, I know family members of one of the main couples that gave money.
Okay. So
that's pretty seedy. It's just seedy and gross, right?
And that's why the leadership of the Maxwell Institute didn't want to have anything to do with that because
who?
Everybody who was at the Maxwell Institute after Dan Petersen was fired. And by the way, I've only met Dan Petersen once, and he was really nice to me.
Yeah,
he doesn't know me from Adam.
He's super friendly in person.
Yeah. But so of course Jerry Bradford, Morgan Davis, and I don't know who did what, but I know that I know who the people were that were there when I was there, who were happy that the Institute could focus much more on scholarship rather than apologetics. Carl Griffin, Christian Heel, I don't know what Paul Hoskinson's feelings were on it, but he wasn't there very long. And then Brian Hoglid came, and he's kind of like this as well. I know Blair Hodges. I mean, like pretty much everybody that was there were like really happy. They're like, okay, we can focus on like making this a more kind of mainstream research institute for religious scholarship.
And as I understand it, they asked Dan Petersen not to publish those pieces. He threw a tantrum on the internet and was fired.
I mean,
that's what I heard.
That's what makes sense to me.
So
anyway, so with this background, the difference about John Gee is that John Gee has an endowed chair. And the way an endowed chair works at a university is that a donor will, put up like 5 million or 20 million or whatever. And then the person in that chair, I mean, it depends on how you set the founding papers, but they live on the interest of that money or whatever. I mean, that's normally how an endowment works. And so if you become an endowed chair, you are an institution unto yourself. And so you have this institution, which is John Gee's position within the umbrella of the Maxwell Institute. Now, I think it's pretty clear that John Gee was much more in favor of the Dan Petersen, Bill Hamlin style type thing. Now, I don't know about his personal relationship with any of these individuals, but in terms of just like which kind of side you'd associate that person with, like John Gee was definitely more, but it's not like they have the power to fire him. Right? The way that they can fire Dan Petersen as an editor of one of their journals, you can do that. And so my entire time that I was there, I hardly ever saw John Gee, and like actually in the office every once in a while. And I did interact with him. I'd be surprised if he recognized me, though. I never got the impression that I made an impression on him. But
why were you surprised that Spencer would refer to him as an apologetic source?
Right. Because it would be like Spencer referring to Dan Petersen as an apologetic source. Like,
in what way?
Because it's like, look, you're referring to somebody. Now, Spencer wasn't part of any of this, right? He was in the history department
at the time.
Yeah, as far as I know, I don't think he had anything to do with this. But it would be as if the people at the Maxwell Institute at the time who were instrumental in removing Dan Petersen from their midst were then to say a few years down the road, oh, why don't you use Dan Petersen as a resource for understanding like how like our faith is true or something like that? Like that doesn't make any sense, right?
Because John Gee what?
Because John Gee is more in that in that camp of Dan Petersen and those folks and everything like that. So
you're saying not a credible scholar when it comes to defending the historicity
it's not,
of the Book of Abraham.
It's not that he's not a credible scholar, because number one, I'm not an Egyptologist, so I can't speak. And as far as I understand, he is internationally recognized for work that he does on Egyptology. But as far as the Book of Abraham goes, that's a separate issue. I think it's bizarre that people whose tactics and their concerns and their investments which are completely antithetical to what the Maxwell Institute is trying to do today, would be leaned on as a resource for somebody who doesn't know what to do with their faith. It would be like okay, so after there was a parting of the ways between the Maxwell Institute and Dan Petersen, they started the Mormon Interpreter. Are you familiar with this?
Yes.
Okay. So it would be like, why would Spencer recommend going down the hall to talk to John Gee? Well, number one, he can do that because he knows that John Gee is not going to talk to this couple probably, because he's not the cuddliest of personalities. But number two, why doesn't he just recommend they read interpreter articles?
Right. Again, because they're not credible.
I mean,
you don't want to say that, but that's kind of what you're saying.
Okay, well, look, I don't have a dog in their fight anymore as to which is credible and which isn't. Like if the Maxwell Institute is Sunstone South and if the Mormon Interpreter is some kind of extremist publication. Like I don't have a dog in that fight right now. And so I don't want to say who's credible or who's not credible. But if I were in Spencer's position, I had the values that I understand him representing, being the director of the Maxwell Institute, it doesn't make any sense for me personally to say, go and look at these people who are doing something like in some ways the opposite of what we're trying to do. That's my opinion.
Which is what? What would the opposite be?
The opposite is sort of this distinction between that you've made between traditional apologetics and more neo-apologetics. That would be.
But Guy's not doing ad hominem stuff, so he's doing what? Just
is Guy never done ad hominem stuff?
Maybe he has, but I mean, he's most known for just trying to provide.
I'll put
Egyptological sort of justifications for.
So the Maxwell Institute is a publishing house. I think they're kind of scaling back on that right now, last I heard. So I don't know the current status. I got to be, clear about what I know and what I don't know. But John Gee just published a book called An Introduction to the Book of Abraham. The Maxwell Institute did not publish it. The Religious Studies Center did, which is the publishing house for religious education. Yeah. Now John Gee has published Book of Abraham stuff with the Maxwell Institute in the past,
right?
But that was before the parting of ways. So like that, it's weird to me that you would recommend somebody to go consult with a person who you wouldn't even publish. That's weird to me. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So back to you. So you're interviewing with this neighbor of your friend, and he pretty much offers you a job. Is that right?
Oh, yeah. Christian Hill does. And it was awesome. Oh, and it was actually, because I was working on a minor in editing, I also got hired at the Religious Studies Center as an editor there. And so I worked there for a semester, but it ended up, because when the summer came around, Christian said he had more money for me. And so I was like, I want to work full time for the Maxwell Institute rather than splitting my attentions. And so I gave up the editing job and I just did the research job.
So what were the main projects you worked on during your time at the Maxwell Institute?
I had three main projects. The number one was, so the Center for the Preservation of Ancient Religious Texts, CPART, which Christian was the director of. Christian is an expert in ancient, what they call late antique, so kind of, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th century Syriac literature. So, and looking at Christian literature in the Syriac language, and that was his expertise. He wrote his dissertation on a Syriac retelling of the Joseph story from the Book of Genesis. And so CPART has lots of research projects, including the digitization of Vatican manuscripts. I mean, there's tens of thousands of Vatican manuscripts, I think they also, sorry if I'm getting this wrong, but they played a huge part in the Dead Sea Scrolls project, which, and then another project that Christian had was the reception history. I can explain what that term means, the reception history of the Book of Genesis. And reception history just basically means, like, instead of focusing on the time period in which the book was created, let's look at the impact of that book on theology, philosophy, art, institutions, whatever, over time. And so he hired me as a medievalist to look at the Book of Genesis in Anglo-Saxon England, so the period about 600 AD to about 1100 AD. And that's what I spent most of my time doing.
It seems like super cool experience.
Yeah, it was awesome.
For an undergrad?
Oh, yeah, I was hired as an undergrad, and then I worked as a graduate student there. It was amazing. And not only that, because Christian Hill was an amazing, I felt, employer. He let me, he just said, look, this is the project, kind of like God in the Book of Ether. I think I've heard Stephen Covey maybe even use this example before, but he's like, okay, you need light. You need light in the boats. What are you going to do? And so he brings the stones and God touches them. I felt like Christian was like that. He's like, look, this is what we're doing. Book of Genesis, 600 to 1100 in England, in Latin and Old English texts. What are you going to do? And he just left me to my devices, and it was awesome. I loved it. I felt it was one of the most formative experiences I had as a scholar. And then, and I ended up putting the research online, and I feel like I heard recently that CPART was discontinued, which is a real shame, but I can get into that. And if it is, I don't know if my research is still on the Maxwell Institute website, but it was about that.
So two things about this. Number one is it doesn't seem, this isn't what most people, when they think of the Maxwell Institute, they think of apologetics.
Right.
A ton of this stuff has nothing to do with
that's
apologetics.
Right. Yeah, most of it does. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Most of it, right?
Yeah, that's right. Uh-huh.
And then the second thing is, you wonder why the church would want to pay so much money and time to invest in these sorts of
Well,
things.
okay, and to be clear, it's not the church per se.
Digitizing Vatican manuscripts.
Right,
But I mean,
yeah.
housing it in the Maxwell
Right,
Institute,
yeah,
you assume that it fits under the mission of BYU and the church in some way, that it advances the values of the church in some way.
Yeah, well, I mean, something that is kind of hard to appreciate is that Mormons are different from other religious fundamentalists in the United States in that they really do value education. Now, what that means, it manifests in different ways, but this is something that is like a core value of the culture and of the religion. And so I think it just falls into the mission of the church as far as that's concerned. The second project that I worked on, which was very brief, I looked at libraries in the Karolingean period, so the reign of Charlemagne. Christian wanted me to look into that to help him out with something for a project he was working on. And then the last thing I did was, I don't remember if it was Christian Heel or Carl Griffin who contacted me first, but this was right before I went to the University of Toronto to start my PhD. They said, hey, we have an issue of our journal, the Studies in the Bible and Antiquity, I think the journal was called. And we're going to kind of focus on Hugh Nibley for this issue. And Hugh Nibley had an unpublished book manuscript in the special collections of BYU, the Harold Bealey Library. And so it was my job to take that, a portion of that manuscript, probably like 25, 30 pages, and then go through all of the Greek and Latin and whatever other English sources that he was using to make this argument, because it was unpublished manuscript. He hadn't filled out all of the references and stuff. And then I had to do that and offer little commentary or translations or whatever. And then I wrote a little 3 or 4 page introduction. So that showed up in that issue. So those were the 3 projects that I did.
So none of your work was apologetics in any way?
No.
Okay.
No.
So did you have any experiences there, for those who are interested in truth claims, for those who are interested in pro-apologetics or neo-apologetics or anti-apologetics, any of the controversies that would sort of relate to someone having faith, not having faith, staying in the church, leaving the church? Did you have any interactions or experiences during your time at the Maxwell Institute that would be interesting to those sorts of people?
Let me think about this. I mean, obviously they're concerned about the status of the church right now, right? Because
who?
Like people who work at the Maxwell Institute. Now you'll get people who work, and that's not just because they work at BYU, because you get people who work like in the engineering department that probably don't know or care about this stuff that's going on, unless they have a personal like family member who's involved, and that has happened,
right.
So with the Maxwell Institute, though, I think they do care about this stuff. I think they care about the fact that a lot of faith crises are going on, or whatever, faith transitions, or what have you. And so that's why they did start that mini series. And I forget what the title that they gave it, but the first book in it, if I remember correctly, was Letters to a Young Mormon.
Out of Miller.
That's right. Yeah. And so, and also you get like they have some kinds of public outreach, like they have their podcast, or they'll have, I think probably the most important thing is not the Maxwell Institute just houses the summer seminars that Richard Bushman or Terrell Gibbons that they do, but I don't think they like sponsor it. I think they just give a space for people to talk about it and stuff like that.
Just describe that really quick. So what happens every year?
Yeah.
Promising young scholars are brought to Provo.
Yeah.
Along with like a Bushman or a Givens.
Yeah, that's right.
To lead the seminar.
That's right.
And everybody writes a paper.
Yeah.
And shares the paper.
That's right.
And then they'll talk about ideas, weekly. Is that?
Yeah. And I think, I don't know for sure, but the impression I always got was that Terrell and Richard used this as an opportunity to work with kind of bright young minds on a research project they were currently writing about. And then a lot of the research that the students came up with, they were able to incorporate into, a book manuscript.
So some of the people that may have gone through that program might be who? that our listeners would know?
I heard once that pretty much every major scholarly voice in
Like
Mormon
Matt
studies.
Bowman.
I think I can't say, I don't know for sure who did or who didn't, but I would be surprised if, it would be more normal if you said a voice that they went through it than if they didn't. If they didn't go through it, I would be a little surprised. Yeah.
So some of the names of people who likely...
I know Jared Hickman did.
Right.
So... Yeah, I don't know. I think what's his name? I don't remember the guy's name. You would know it. He's the other. Shoot, I know Josh Weed was kind of something of a poster boy for a time, but now that he and his wife are getting divorced, there was
Mansfield.
Yes, that's the guy.
He was part of it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And not when I was never a part of it. I was in the office when they were having it, and I'd walk by and I'd see some friends and we'd chat and go to lunch or whatever. But yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the books, I'm looking at the Maxwell Institute now, the Living Faith books.
That's the series. Mm-hmm.
Is that the series that you're talking about?
That's the one.
So that's Letters to a Young Mormon, Planted by Patrick Mason.
Yeah.
Is listed.
I consider pretty much all of these books apologetic in nature in some way or another. Yeah.
Yeah. So Stephen Peck's.
But it's a very different type of apologetics than the old Farms book review. I think anybody who opens up either could see the difference, right?
Well, let's talk about that. So the Maxwell Institute has clearly gone through a transformation. Yeah. They used to publish the Mormon Studies Review, Book of Mormon Review. What was it called?
As I remember, there are basically there have been primarily three journals. One has something to do with Bible, one has something to do with LDS scripture, and one has something to do with Mormon something or other, like studies or whatever. But they've gone through so many different changes that off the top of my head, I couldn't say what was which. And so the Farms book review, I think Daniel Petersen was the editor for 20 years. So, I mean, that's significant.
And this would be if anyone like Michael Quinn or Brett Metcalf wrote a book that the church didn't like.
Yeah.
It would kind of be massacred.
But also so you can kind of feel the weight of Dan Petersen getting fired or whatever. It would be as if your nonprofit, Open Stories Foundation, were subsumed into a larger institution. And then the people who came in after you got rid of you. Yeah. And said, you can't do...
Which could happen.
Who knows?
Maybe someday it will happen.
Just so you can kind of feel the weight of it, because the Farms was a nonprofit before it was ever associated with the church. Yeah. And then it was subsumed into the church, I think, in 2006. Yeah.
So he kind of lost his organization when that
happened. And it was Jack Welch's organization. He founded it. But people who got in early, people like Dan Petersen and those folks, yeah. So in a way, they were sort of ousted of their own game, I guess. Right. Yeah.
And do you have any way to describe the way that the Maxwell Institute has moved? We try to get them to come on Mormon Stories and they won't come on. So it's kind of absurd that we have to sit here and try and vaguely describe their movements, but they fear that if they came on, bad things could happen to them. So they don't come on.
Well, and just a little insight into that. Okay, so the way that the power hierarchy works is that the Maxwell Institute is itself. But now it's under the university directly. There's not a department or a college in between them and the university administration. So they deal with the university directly. And then the university leadership deals with, people in Salt Lake.
Board of directors.
Well, the board of directors, I think, is mostly apostles, but I don't know what they actually do on a day-to-day basis as far as the university is concerned. And so a lot of that work, I think, gets delegated out to other 70. And what's his name? Cecil Samuelson, was he the first, he was a general authority and then that was his assignment? Where I think a lot of the presidents before that became general authorities afterwards, but he might have been the first one who was actually a general authority when he was assigned to BYU. And I think Kevin Worthen, is he a general authority? I don't know. I don't know either. And so depending on who the academic vice president is, now if it's somebody like John Tanner, who, he's a very generous and magnanimous individual, versus somebody else who will be like, if any, BYU professor publishes in Dialogue, I'm going to have their, resignation on my desk in the morning or whatever. There are political wins. And, but to give you a general feel, somebody that I worked with at the Maxwell Institute once said to me, an exchange they had with somebody in a position of power. I don't know if it was a general authority. I don't know if it was at the university level. I don't know if it was a Salt Lake person. I don't know. But they asked, okay, could you help spell out what the boundary lines are so that we know not to cross them? And the response was, no, 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 no. You do not understand. It is not your job to know where the boundaries are so that you don't cross them. It is your job to be so far from a boundary line that you can't even see it. Right? And so I have no idea if there are special directives given to people at the Maxwell Institute that say, don't affiliate with, group X, Y, or Z. I have no idea. But I do feel like there is a general sense of, look, let's not do anything stupid. And stupid from their perspective means something that could hurt our donor base, hurt our credibility in the LDS community or in the eyes of the church or university leadership. And so they're not going to, from their institutional perspective, they don't see themselves primarily as a public outreach group or, doing PR or whatever. They have to do a lot of PR, but they don't want to do that. And so they don't really see themselves as being like obligated or responsible to talk to podcasters or whatever. Yeah.
Well, part of when Daniel Petersen was making a lot of noise in this regard, he would talk about why it was set up to begin with. And he made quotes that I think from some Neal A. Maxwell talk that was given early on.
Yeah.
I think there's a term, no layups, no uncontested layups or something to that effect.
Yeah.
That you get the critics. You know what I mean? And so I guess I'm trying to get you to talk about the shift away from apologetics and ad hominem.
Yeah.
And then it's worth noting that many of the founders of the Maxwell Institute feel like it has strayed from the original mission.
Well, right.
For which it was established and for which Neal A. Maxwell himself endorsed.
So in that perspective, don't they have something to say, right? But then the name Maxwell just becomes a political football for different tactics. And they say, well, it's true. He wanted us to not let the critics get slam dunks or whatever it was. But I'm sure Elder Maxwell would not have wanted us to do it in the way that you, Dan Petersen, or Bill Hamlin, or whoever else did. And so they can use that as just like a name, to say, well, what we're doing more fully represents what Neal A. Maxwell says. And, 100 years from now, nobody's going to care what Neal A. Maxwell represents.
People may not care now, actually.
Right.
I think a lot of people... Honestly, it's weird because 5-10 years ago, this stuff seemed to really matter.
Yeah.
And in 2018, apologetics in the Maxwell Institute, frankly, seemed to matter very little in comparison. Now, that's my perspective, but I've got a pretty good finger on the pulse. I don't know what you see.
Well, yeah, and also, it's the same problem with BYU because Hugh Nibley has this collection of essays called Brother Brigham Challenges the Saints. And I think in one of the essays or the intro or something, he was just saying, I am not going to shy away from what the prophet Brigham Young taught, speaking from a place which is a university that carries his name. Right now, it's kind of unfortunate because Brigham Young was a racist and in some ways kind of like this totalitarian and all of these bad things. And so you're kind of well, and actually a lot of institutions are in this awkward place, right? Where they exist because some terrible person exploited resources, labors, and native populations, and then gave a portion of their wealth to these institutions of learning or whatever. And so now they're in the awkward position that universities, I guess, are getting more of a conscience or something, or trying to do this. They're like, oh, should we rename this stuff? And so then you kind of come up with a weird, anyway, I won't get into that.